So this is my robot offspring. I want to start this evening by asking, by sharing with you a question that I often find myself asking. Because the reason why I'm sort of asking how did I end up here is because for those of you who are academics, you know, I did spend a lot of time as an academic, and in academia, you know, there's this sense that you know, you're there for the pursuit of knowledge, and there's a purity in that. And you know, this is actually the library in Trinity College Dublin, where I did not attend, but it was built in the 15th century, and you can see like even the sort of academic learning centres are built as if they're cathedrals, you know. So there's a very higher order kind of pursuit. And so pre-Woebot, this was my perception of academia. And this was my perception of business and startups and industry, sort of like, you know, evil, profit motive, president business. The truth is, of course, that there is, you know, a lot of potential where these worlds collide and come together, and probably nowhere is that more true than here in Silicon Valley. You know, the truth is that we're all trying to solve the same problem, which I actually, you know, don't need to go into too much detail about because you've just got a fantastic introduction. But you know, it turns out that mental disorders are the #1 most expensive illness in the US. This is data from 2013. Costing more than 200 billion, and this does not include hospitalizations. This is just on antidepressant and other psychopharm medication and psychotherapy appointments. But again, similar statistic, and I think this is fairly conservative. You know, about 2/3 of people with mental health problems do not receive care. And nowhere is this actually more striking than on college campuses, which is where I started out doing this work. And it turns out that about half of college populations across the US suffer from debilitating symptoms of depression and anxiety, they experience these symptoms in the past year so severe that they can't function. 50%. So I don't know about you, but that was not my college experience. We know from the great epidemiological studies that from Daniel Eisenberg that these problems are growing both in terms of prevalence and in severity. And it's interesting that despite the relative ubiquity of sort of low-cost mental health services on campuses, a lot of people just do not present for care. So there's, you know, it suggests that something about the form factor may be broken. And we know that you know, the need for help is currently not met. Therapy is certainly stigmatized. It tends to be difficult to access, and it's expensive. So our mission as a company was to make the best mental health tools that we have sort of radically accessible. And in order to meet this need, we have a very specific theory that solutions need to be effective, highly engaging, and scalable. And all of these three things need to be in place. And so let me take you through efficacy. Just as an example, I think our field in general has suffered from a lack of rigor. There has been a lot of, when, you know, smartphones came into the world in 2008, the most popular category were in the health and fitness area, and virtually none had any actual evidential support to suggest that they were effective. But the actual field of digital mental health has been around a lot longer, and there's about 2 decades of research work that suggests that you can deliver cognitive behavioural therapy in particular, which is the most rigorously studied and well-researched approach that we have, over the internet and in vastly more scalable ways. And so there was a recent meta-analysis published of all mental health related apps that included abstracts from 5,500 different research activities, and they covered a total of just 5 randomized control trials. And by the end of that year in 2014, the number of these apps that were actually commercially available was 0. So big problem. This is the classic sort of research practice gap. You have a lot of people on the right-hand side building consumer apps that don't necessarily, you know, have a drive to validate their data, and then you have a lot of people on the left in academia doing their thing, but not necessarily building things that would be widely available in the commercial sense. So we try to do both effectively. And so we launched our company Woebot to coincide with the publication of our first randomized control trial that we did at Stanford, that showed that after 2 weeks, the group that spoke to Woebot for 2 weeks had significant reductions in depression compared to a control group that just had access to an ebook, so they were an information-only control group. You can see that at the start of the study, on average, this group were actually in the moderate to severe range as measured by the PHQ-9, the most validated sort of measure for depression that we have. And by the end of the 2-week period, they were at the bottom of the moderate range. So this was a very clinically meaningful reduction. The other piece that's significant about this, of course, is that the period was just 2 weeks. And so that's actually a very fast response to treatment. If you were talking about traditional clinical outcomes research, you'd be looking at about 4 weeks. What's interesting about that is that response to treatment across problem areas and across therapeutic approaches is one of the most predictive factors for overall good outcomes. We also have an ongoing commitment to research that's really important to us as a company. So we have an ongoing study with the OBGYN department at Stanford looking at Woebot's usefulness with women who've just had a baby. And are also kind of talking to other groups as well to really validate in specific problem areas. The other piece, of course, is the highly engaging piece. And the reason why this is important is because, working through your negative thoughts and, understanding how you have contributed to an interpersonal conflict, all of these kinds of things are not that much fun. And so if you can wrap it up in a package that actually encourages daily usage, then you actually, you keep people in the intervention and you keep them learning. And it turns out that there's some really preliminary studies, but some really interesting work has been done looking at people randomized to either AI or a condition where they're told that there is a person behind the AI. And it turns out that people are more likely to share more and have deeper conversations when they're told that it's an AI. So in some sense, people would rather speak to something when it's not human, particularly in the context of stigma. And interestingly, men are 300% more likely to talk to an AI than a human therapist about life, finances and emotional health. So one of the most interesting things I think from our study was that people on average spoke to Woebot 12 times over the 14-day period. So in other words, they were using Woebot almost daily. And so this doesn't look like traditional therapy, right? It's a kind of a consistent dose, if you like, of 50 minutes that week, but broken up into 5-10 minute engagements every day. And there seems to be, something in that about the digestibility. But interestingly, we've noticed that there was a qualitative component to our study, and we found that the things that people would say about Woebot suggested that they were really relating to Woebot as if Woebot was a kind of a real thing, even though they were at the same time acknowledging that it was not. So they would say things like, I know Woebot's just a chatbot, but it really feels like, nice that he's sort of checking in on me and things like that. So Woebot feels more like a friend than an app. That was a kind of a typical kind of statement we would get. And so another brilliant researcher from Stanford looked at this and conducted another study where he investigated the idea and the possibility that Woebot could establish a working alliance, which is effectively like a therapeutic alliance with its users in the same way and using the same instrument that we use in traditional therapeutic outcomes research. It was called the Working Alliance Inventory. And what he found was that not only does Woebot establish a therapeutic bond that does increase over time, as you would expect from a human-to-human relationship, but on some subscales, Woebot actually performs slightly better than their rating for their last human therapist. So we were kind of hoping for something that approximated a relationship with the human therapist, but it was very, very striking that it's almost equivalent, and in some cases in excess. But when you look at the kind of items that make up the subscale, it's things like Woebot is there for me when I need him, and of course there's very few clinicians who are with you at 2 a.m. when you're having a panic attack, right? Whereas an app can be. Okay, so the final piece, of course, is scalability, and this is, in a sense, we're very like other, I guess, AI companies that have done well. They tend to represent the combination of, domain expertise with data science, and for us, there is a very strong partnership between the clinical expertise in the company and the AI expertise. And in addition, there is a sort of a third pillar of a great user experience, because if you don't have that, then people will not stay in the experience and you cannot get data. And so this is sort of the trifecta, if it were, the bones of an engine. And then we exchange about 1 to 2 million messages every week, and that's the fuel that keeps the engine going. And I could speak to more about that. I really could talk about this for a long time, but I'll keep going. But feel free to ask questions afterwards. But I thought I would finish with just some description of really Woebot's belief system, which, if it's not obvious, is my belief system when it comes to this stuff. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. But the reason why we actually launched this, we launched Woebot with a distinct belief system, and why Woebot has a character is so that when people are interacting with it, they have a really good understanding of what Woebot stands for, but these are effectively design principles that shape each encounter that a user has with the application. And so the first is that humans are interesting and dynamic, and what he means is that humans are sort of constantly changing, and that really we feel is a sort of an empowerment principle, and so that you're not sort of condemned by a symptom or condemned by a diagnosis, and that in fact diagnostic labels are for learning and should be used as such, but that everybody's capable of change and are constantly changing. Another thing that we really believe in, that we try and communicate as much as possible, is that Woebot is not actually trying to passively diagnose anybody or passively detect emotion. That we wouldn't and Woebot says, even if I could, I will just ask you how you feel. Because the important piece here is self-reflection rather than, passively kind of getting information for people. And I think that is a nuance that will become important as we see more and more sort of emotional AI out in the field. Woebot believes that distorted thinking is just a part of being human, that everybody has distorted thoughts. So this is very explicitly, we're trying to take things out of the exclusive domain of the clinic. And I really do believe that everybody does have distorted thinking, particularly in conditions of intense emotion. That it's just part of being human. And as such, Woebot is actually agnostic to diagnosis. We're not trying to be in the business of diagnosing anything. It's built to be helpful in that moment of reaching out. So helpful at the level of the single encounter. Very similarly, there's an underlining principle here around growth mindset, that mistakes are embraced and are sort of part of the learning adventure. And that this also pertains in the context of mental health, that your label does not define you, right? That your label is actually some information about ways that you might actually be reaching out for help. Sitting with open hands is a concept that, of course, it's a Buddhist concept, but it's also something that David Burns, one of my teachers, taught me, which is basically the idea that you should never force somebody to change, that it's always up to them. So we never presume that if somebody wants help, we always ask, we always issue an invitation, and we also don't employ any sort of persuasive tech tricks, because we're a bunch of clinicians rather than great font designers. Also, we believe that cognitive behavioural therapy, these are just good life skills. And so for any clinicians in the audience, I think we always get this feeling when you're learning this stuff, you just think, wow, people should be learning this stuff in schools. And we think it can be useful for everybody, but of course it's not always going to be sufficient. And that we fully embrace that people may actually need to get a lot more help. And Woebot's really open to that and encourages conversation around that as well. In vivo learning is usually favourable, so this is a concept from online learning methodology. So rather than a 1 hour sort of lecture, if you like, at the end of the week, we know that learning that is embedded in people's lives and delivered at a meaningful moment tends to be more effective. We also believe that humour is useful, not to minimise anybody's problems, but actually, I mean, this is something that I would have done when I saw patients as well, that well-placed humour can actually break the sort of hypnosis of being transfixed or weighed down by extreme sort of negative emotion, and allows the work to continue. So again, Woebot would never minimise anybody's problems, but he also does not take himself too seriously. And I wanted to say self-help here, but that is such a negative connotation. So we believe in guided self-care. And I think there's probably no more empowering notion than learning the skills to help yourself. Is very, and it's completely complementary to standard clinical care. But this is a concept we also really believe in. That's all I have. Thank you very much. Look forward to your questions.